Hey, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the 1990s. I see some of these videos out there on YouTube, and they talk about the 1990s in a sort of overall cultural way, which I think is kind of neat, but it's always missing something where I'm like, wait a minute, that wasn't how it was for me. I don't remember that, or you make that out to be a lot bigger than it really was, or something like that. So I figured I would make a small video where I kind of just talked about something a little bit more smaller in scope, which is my experience of the 1990s. Because I think it's a very subjective thing. I mean, it's a decade, right? I mean, it's going to depend on where you come from, how old you were at the time, your culture, like a whole bunch of things are going to factor into what your experience of the 1990s was, or any decade for that matter. Here's the thing. People have different nostalgia for different decades, and I think a lot of it comes down to what decade you were living the good life during, so to speak. Like, was the good life when you were a kid or a teenager, or maybe like in your early 20s? I mean, we all kind of look back on one or all of those eras with rose-colored glasses once we, hit our 30s and 40s and so on. Like, and I think for a lot of people, it's their teenage years, so it's the decade they were a teenager in. But for some people, it's like their early 20s, and for others, it was when they were a kid. And for me, though, if I had to pick one, it would probably be the 90s. As much as the 80s were influential on me because that was when I was a kid, the one that was the most dynamic for me was definitely the 1990s. So let's start with the early 90s. And this is how I remember the 90s. Again, this is subjective. It depends on who you were, where you're from. I'm an American from the Midwest, born in the beginning of 1979. So for me, I entered 1990 as a 10-year-old, and I turned 11 that year, very early in that year. And I remember the early 1990s as basically the 80s still. I think that every decade for a couple of years is a carryover from the decade before. Like, it's almost like it takes the decade a couple of years before it can develop its own style and its own persona. And I think that the 80s definitely carried over for the first couple of years in the early 90s. And you can see it with certain pop culture things going on, like hip hop and stuff like that. I mean, I remember like the music scene in the early 90s being like a lot of hip hop and R&B type stuff. It was like Naughty by Nature and like Boyz II Men and Vanilla Ice and MC Hammer and stuff like that. Like, there's a lot of like stuff like that, like Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch, Mark Wahlberg, stuff like that. Like early 90s, it was still really colorful. It was really bright. I remember like the early Saved by the Bell episodes, because I would watch Saved by the Bell. It was always super like 80s looking. The fashion was still very kind of neonish and just baggy and like, I don't know, it has a certain kind of 80s. I think a lot of times when people think of the 80s, especially like retrospectively, like now, they're like retro 80s stuff, a lot of it's like late 80s, early 90s. Some of it's like mid 80s. But a lot of it seems like it's like late 80s, early 90s. But that's just how I remember it. That's how I view it. But again, like, I was still a kid by that point. I was still 10, 11 years old. So I don't really remember the mid 80s, as much as somebody who might have been a teenager or an adult at that point. But for me, yeah, like the early 90s was still very much the 80s. And then around 92, 93, the 90s and myself developed differently. Like, things developed into the 90s, or what I remember the 90s being. And it was at that point in my life that music changed. And music at that point in my life, as an early teenager, preteen, early teenager, really started to play a role in my life. And the music scene really started to shift at that point too. That's when like stuff like grunge and industrial music really kind of entered into my life. Actually, it was industrial that entered before grunge for me personally. It was like Nine Inch Nails, Pretty Hate Machine, which I got introduced to in like 91 or 92 or early 92 or something like that. And I heard like that album and it was like changed my life. It was like the music I'd always been waiting my whole life to hear or whatever. It was kind of crazy. And that kind of carried through the rest of the 90s for me. But the early 90s definitely, like, grunge came in, obviously, stuff like Nirvana, stuff like, Soundgarden and Pearl Jam and Smashing Pumpkins and bands like that and everything, like on the whole, like, sort of alternative / grunge scene. And also, like I said, for me personally and my close friends, it was also industrial music, stuff like Nine Inch Nails and Ministry and KMFDM and later on, I guess, some Marilyn Manson and stuff. So for me, I entered into high school in 93 and grunge hit its peak in like 94, I think it was, somewhere around there. Like 93, 94 is when grunge kind of hit its peak. And then, so for my friends and I, like, we were kind of like a mix. Like, we were kind of like combat boots or Doc Martens with like Ministry t-shirts and flannels over the top, or like, like thermal shirts with like band t-shirts over the top and like long hair and, like that, and like ripped jeans and stuff. Like, that was the 90s. Like, that was our style, but it wasn't like that for everybody, but that's how it was for, for my friends and myself back in high school and stuff. And I had a ball in the 90s. I really did. Like, it was, like I said, it was a decade that fluctuated a lot because I went from childhood to adulthood. But it was a pretty crazy decade. There was a lot of cool stuff that came out, and like when I look back now on that decade, if I had to categorize the decade as a season, the 90s reminded me of the fall. Like, of all the seasons, like I think of the fall, because it seemed like there was this sort of like kind of this darkness over the whole decade. But it wasn't like a bad darkness necessarily. It was this kind of comforting kind of darkness that was kind of weird. It was almost like a Halloween kind of darkness, like every day is Halloween. No, but yeah, it was kind of like that in a way. It was weird because it was like there was a lot of like dark stuff that was going on in the 90s, at least from my perspective. Some people remember the 90s as like TLC and Friends and like this very like poppy, like whatever. Like, that's not how I remember the 90s. Like, I remember that stuff in the 90s and I hated it back then. But I remember the 90s as being like movies like The Crow and, Strange Days and Fight Club and Hardware and The Matrix and Seven and just a lot of these like really sort of dark psychological movies or cyberpunk kind of like content, like Johnny Mnemonic and like The Lawnmower Man and like music like, My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, Nine Inch Nails and like stuff like that. Like this, like I remember the 90s as being like kind of dark, and like I remember like everybody wearing like yin and yang like symbols, or like hemp chokers and bracelets and stuff, or like it was this weird mashup combination of like all these different things, from like hippies to like grungy people to like rivet heads. It was like people like were also like more spiritual, like the whole like it seemed like people were like, it was like there was like this whole other subside of things where it was like enigma and delirium and like this whole like and like deep forest and like this whole like kind of like electronic tribal kind of music going on as well, like where it was like people burning incense and candles and like it was this weird era, like this very weird kind of crazy era, like that I remember, like, but it was cool. Like it was coffee shops and cigarettes and like like just like conversations like before anybody like was being bothered by phones like going off or staring into phones for hours and ignoring everybody around them. Like people were like conversing with each other and getting into like very deep metaphysical conversations, or at least what they thought, what we all thought were like deep metaphysical conversations about the universe and, you know, reality and stuff and society, but like in the end weren't really that as deep as we probably thought they were. I don't know. Just kind of like, I don't know how to even describe it, but yeah, but it was still cool. You know, it was still very cool. It was like, it was definitely time to be alive as a teenager for sure. And it was a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun. But there was also some really dark, depressing times too, you know? I mean, I tend to look back on that era with rose-colored glasses because I was a teenager and an early adult. But there were, you know, I didn't always have the best times during that decade either, you know, personally. So, I mean, there were times that the darkness was more dark, you know, and it wasn't a comforting kind of darkness. And it was a struggle at times. And we didn't have the resources that maybe we have today. You know, some of the technology we lean on today, like the internet, or always having, you know, the internet in your pocket with your smartphone, or just always being able to contact people. Like, you know, you didn't have that all the time, which was both a blessing and a curse, depending on, you know, what the objective was, I guess. So it wasn't all rosy. It wasn't all great. Like there were times where it was really kind of hard and things were just weird. But it was also, but for the most part, I look back on it fondly, and I think that it was a really cool decade. Would I want to go back to that decade today? No, probably not. I think I enjoy missing it more than I enjoyed actually being there. As much as I did enjoy being there, I think I enjoy missing it more than that, because it's one of those things where it's a time and place thing, you know, you had to be there kind of thing. And if I were to go back now in my 40s to the 90s, I would have a very different experience of the 90s than I did as a teenager and early adult in the 90s. There's certainly some things I would pick up. Like if I could take a time machine and go back, there's some things I would definitely pick up to bring back with me now. Like certain things that like were available then that maybe aren't available now, like mini discs, for example. Like that's something, but that's like a whole other subject. That's like a whole like little like hobby obsession of mine. Like stuff like that, like little things like that. Like at the time we like sort of like didn't care about, or wasn't big, or we just took advantage of it or whatever. That like now we, you know, just are like, whoa, you know, or like invest in Apple stock or something, you know, something crazy like that. Like, you know, like, but like, other than that, no, I don't think I would want to go back to the 90s now. Not as a, you know, 40 something. I think I would have a very different experience. I don't think I would have as much fun. I think it would be just, it would be more of a pain in the ass, because I wouldn't have access to things like high-speed internet. Well, by the late 90s I would, but it wouldn't be nearly the same as it is today. You know, it's not the same at all. But yeah, other than that, like it was a cool decade. Like there was definitely, you know, there was definitely things about it that were really cool. And I'm glad I got the chance to be alive in that decade and I got to experience it. But I should probably give a message to younger people, because one of the other things I've noticed is that there are a lot of younger people out there these days, Gen Z folks, who they have a sort of nostalgia for the 80s and 90s, and they weren't alive back then. But they look back on the media and they look back on, you know, what people say about it, and they kind of wish that they had been. Enjoy the time you have now, because what you're seeing is us, people my age, looking back, like I said, with nostalgia, with rose-colored glasses, And one day you'll likely do the same for the 2010s or the 2020s. You're not going to realize it for a couple of decades. But then in a couple of decades, you'll look back with the same kind of fondness that a lot of us look back on now with the 70s, 80s, or 90s, because you were a kid or a teenager during those decades. And so the only advice I can give you is enjoy it now. You know, try to live your life now as if you're already wearing those rose-colored glasses and already looking at the current era the way you will look at it 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. So it's really about enjoying the here and now as best you can. The 80s and 90s were a lot of fun, but the reality is now is a lot of fun too. It's all about perspective. It really is. And one day you'll look back on now and you'll realize, oh yeah, it was really cool. And there was a lot of cool things going on. And you'll sort of take stock of those things and count them up and realize, you know, what you had missed out on, or, you know, what you had experienced and how much you enjoyed it. So just keep that in mind. You know, it's always easier to look back on some other era and say, oh, people had a lot of fun in that era. I wish I was around then. But you know what? Enjoy the era you're in, because, you know, you get to experience the 2010s as a kid or a teenager or early 20-something or whatever in a way that I never will. You know, I don't get to experience, like I personally, like I look at some of the things younger people are doing today and wish I was younger and could experience those things in the same way. Like there's some really cool things going on that are acceptable today, or things that people do today that just never, like, we didn't do back. Like one example is the whole cosplay scene. Like, it wasn't really a thing in the 80s or 90s that it is today. Like people making costumes and going to Comic Cons and like stuff like that. Like, I mean, yeah, that's kind of a niche thing. It's something for, you know, a certain group of people that not everybody might be into. But it's one example of one thing that, like, in the 90s, if you had done that, you would have been considered a nerd. Like, people would have looked at you and been like, what? Like, you would have been considered a nerd. Like, I mean, even if people like myself, I did like some anime back in the 90s, but it wasn't something you told everybody necessarily. Like, nowadays, there's, like, no stigma about it. Like, you just, you know, maybe in the 90s you liked movies like Ghost in the Shell or something, or like a few things like that, and that was cool. But, like, you know, otherwise, like, it's not something you admitted. It's not, you didn't like make costumes and dress up as characters and go, like, it's just not something you did. But, like, it's cool that people do that today. Like, it's really cool that people do that today. And it's, you know, somebody in my 40s, I mean, I could probably still get away with it. I'd feel a little silly about it, though. That's the thing. But if I was in my 20s or something, I'd be all about it. I'd be like, yeah, heck yeah, let's do this. So, I mean, and that's one example of one thing. It's just an example to show that, you know, there's all kinds of things that change over time, and, like, enjoy where you're at now, because you have access to certain things that we didn't back then. And so you might look back on, you know, what we did in the 80s or 90s and say, oh, that was really cool, I wish I could have done that. But there's things going the other way, you know, where I'm looking back forward at now and going, I wish I was younger and I could do that. So, you know, it's the whole grass is always greener on the other side of the fence thing. So keep that in mind. I think that's it. I think that's all I have to say about the 90s. I mean, I could go for hours and hours, but this video would be hours and hours long, and that's just not going to work. So, yeah, that's it. Everyone have a good one. Enjoy the era that you're in. Try to look at the era you're in, you know, and enjoy the most out of it, because one day you're going to look back at it, you know, with nostalgia. So enjoy it like you are already living it. That didn't come out right, did it? Enjoy it like you are already looking back at it with nostalgia. That's what I meant to say. All right, have a good one.